If you've ever watched Under the Tuscan Sun or read one of Frances May's books, or maybe you've even been lucky enough to visit Tuscany, then you're probably familiar with the wines of Chianti, Brunello di Montalcino, maybe even Vino Nobile di Montepulciano. But sometimes you've heard this term Super Tuscan. What are Super Tuscan wines anyway? This is really a story about rebellion that started in the region of Chianti. Let's go all the way back to the Etruscans. The Etruscans were this ancient civilization that existed well before the Romans, and they had amphora that they stored wine in, and were really advanced winemakers at the time. In essence, this civilization was the first Super Tuscans. We'll skip by the Romans. The Romans actually learned a lot of their winemaking techniques from the Etruscans, but let's fast forward to the Great Renaissance. And the Renaissance was a time of a rebirth in culture, in art. The city of Florence was really the epicenter of the Renaissance. And at the time, the Medicis really ruled over Florence and the surrounding land. And in the year 1716, the Grand Duke of Tuscany, Cosimo Medici III, actually created the first legal boundaries or appellations for wine regions in the area. Chianti was one of them. So fast forward another 150 years, and we're in the middle of the 1800s, and there was a gentleman named Bettino Ricasoli. And Bettino Ricasoli was actually the second prime minister of Italy after they unified as a country. He was a winemaker at the estate called Castello Broglio, and the Ricasolis to this day still make great wine. But what Bettino did was he basically created a formula for what Chianti should be. He spent years studying, and he determined that Chianti should be 70% Sangiovese, along with 15% of Canaiolo. And then he said for wines that should be consumed young, you could blend in another 15% of white grapes. So how is it that Chianti went from being this great wine of the Renaissance to being kind of an inexpensive, cheap, everyday quaffer that was sold in these straw-covered bottles called fiaschi or fiasco? Before I tell you, like, subscribe, and ring that bell, and go ahead and leave some comments as well. So we've entered into the early 20th century now, and Italy had its problems. You had 2 world wars and a fascist government in the middle of all that, and the wine industry really kind of fell into a bit of disrepair. In the 1930s, the fascist government decreed some laws, and basically what they did is they expanded that original Chianti zone into a much larger zone, and they basically adopted the Ricasoli formula, only they said that white grapes must be used, not can be used, but must be used. Then in the 1960s, the Italian government, after the wars, got together and formed some wine laws. They formed the DOC laws. You may remember from a previous video that Nathan and I did, we talked about the DOC and DOCG laws. Soon after that, there were some winemakers in the area, most notably Piero Antinori in Tuscany, who had just taken over the family's estate. The Antinoris had been making wine since the 1400s in Tuscany. So Piero Antinori decides he's going to make a wine in Tuscany, in the Chianti Classico zone, and not blend in white grapes. Well, the Italian government at the time says, well, if you don't follow the rules, then you can't call yourself Chianti. And Piero Antinori, he says, I don't care about your DOC laws. I'm going to make the best wine I can make. And in 1971, he released the first vintage of Tignanello. At the time, it was 100% Sangiovese. So this wine was made in Chianti Classico with 100% Sangiovese, but because it didn't adhere to the laws, it was just labeled as Vino da Tavola, or classified at the lowest level of Italian wine. Meanwhile, back on the Tuscan coast, in a town called Bolgheri, Piero Antinori's uncle, Mario Incisa della Rocchetta, he was making a wine called Sassicaia at his Tenuta San Guido estate. In 1978, Decanter magazine actually had a competition. This decanter tasting was with 33 different wines from Bordeaux, and Sassicaia was thrown in there. And sure enough, Sassicaia won this competition. This instantly put Sassicaia on the map as a wine to be reckoned with. In fact, the 1985 vintage of Sassicaia received 100 points from Robert Parker. Back in the Chianti Classico region, due to the success of Tignanello, other producers started bottling either 100% Sangiovese wines or mixing in a little bit of international varieties like Cabernet or Merlot into the blends. Once again, these wines did not fall under the DOC classification, so they were just table wines. Now all of a sudden the Italian government realizes they have a problem. Many of Italy's best wines, those from the Chianti Classico region and those from Bolgheri, were commanding the highest prices, getting the best scores from all the wine critics, and they just fell in this Vino da Tavola category. In 1992, they created a new category of wine called IGT wines. The IGT category was sort of an all-encompassing category to blend in these Super Tuscan wines. So just what is a Super Tuscan wine? There are no legal, hard, fast rules on what classifies a wine to be Super Tuscan. Generally, they're red wines with lots of structure and lots of power, and typically they cost lots of money too. So what kind of food would you pair with a Super Tuscan wine? Well, it all depends where it comes from. If it comes from Bolgheri, you're dealing with mainly Cabernet, Bordeaux-styled wines. A big piece of grilled meat is perfect with it. If the wine comes from the Chianti Classico region and it's mainly Sangiovese based, like a Chianti Classico, then there's no better pairing, as Dr. Lecter would say, than some nice liver sauteed with fava beans. So now that you know a little more about Super Tuscan wines, come shop one of our many stores across the state of Florida or visit us at abcfws.com and check out our other videos.